I'm Doris Schattschneider. I'm a professor emerita of mathematics at Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Can you tell me about your mathematical background?
Yes, my graduate work was at Yale and in algebraic groups. I wrote my dissertation in algebraic groups, and my first teaching job was at Northwestern University. My husband was at the University of Chicago working on a PhD. And there I was able to continue work in algebraic groups. There were people to talk to. There were seminars to go to at the University of Chicago. But when we left the University of Chicago, or Chicago in general, and came to Moravian College, I was hired by the college to teach in the math department. My husband went to the theological seminary where he taught church history. It was really impossible to continue in that field. It's a field where if you are working on a deep research problem, if you put it down, and typically you can't do a whole lot of research during the year at a liberal arts institution, the teaching load is pretty heavy. You can't come back 6 months later and pick it up. It's going to take you almost a month to get back to where you were. So I had to give it up. But then I kind of fell into this whole area that's called discrete mathematics, and particularly tiling, tiling the plane, tiling surfaces, and that's what led me to Escher's work.
There's continuous elements to tiling. There are families of tiles and so forth. Did you feel that there was still a bridge between your previous work and the new work?
Well, the one bridge, of course, was groups.
Yes.
In tiling, you talk about symmetry groups and particular subgroups of them and so on. So I was completely comfortable talking about groups. And in fact, there's a particular kind of group that turns up in algebraic groups, that is reflection groups. And of course, that too is part of discrete mathematics and related to tiling theory. So there was some overlap.
Now, Escher was still alive when you were a math student, even though it wasn't your research area at the time. Were you even aware of his work at the time he was still alive?
I became aware of his work when I was in college. This is when he was becoming quite popular. So they would sell posters every spring in one of the college buildings so that you could put up Escher posters in your dorm room, that sort of thing. But the serious interest in his tessellations, how did he make these? How did he find them? And what was the geometry or the mathematics that governed these, or even was there? I didn't know any of that, and that's what I ultimately ended up really researching in great depth.
Now, who were the major mathematicians working on tiling when you started?
Branko Grunbaum is the most important name, and he ultimately became my mentor. At the time I started teaching a course, I kind of invented a course for art majors that would connect mathematics and art. I titled the course The Mathematics of Decorative Design and Art. And I had to teach myself and then in turn teach the students. I had to write up my own notes. There was really nothing they could read that wasn't extremely technical. But the whole idea of learning about isometries, how they interact, how they govern what we call periodic patterns, that is those that repeat by translation or sliding in two different directions. I had to learn all that and then impart it to my students. And fairly soon, I can't really quite remember how I encountered Branko, but I was working on incorporating some Escher designs onto surfaces that had a periodic pattern as a grid. And I remember showing him some of this work I was doing, and from that point on he was very interested in what I was doing, but even better for me, he was working on tiling problems and working on various research papers that ultimately ended up in what has become kind of the Bible of tiling theory, namely a book called Tilings and Patterns. And we corresponded. He would send me preprints of his chapters as he was writing them. I would vet them or say I didn't understand or that this problem was wrong or whatever. So I would say Branko Grunbaum was the biggest influence and certainly the most well-known at that time.
Now, since we're at the G4G, I should pursue the connection between Gardner and Escher. And that was Coxeter as the in-between in that
Yes.
situation. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And more importantly, can you tell us about Gardner's role in the public acclaim that Escher later got?
Gardner was very much at the center of that. Gardner had already been well known to Coxeter, and Coxeter had sent him the book that was about to be published, which was a geometry book, which was, for its time, the 1960s, very unusual. It had a whole chapter on symmetry. Coxeter had already been in touch and wanted to use one of Escher's tessellations as an illustration. So Gardner wrote to Escher and introduced himself and asked permission. And surprisingly, Escher said, "Oh, I already know you, but not as a writer for Scientific American, but as doing the annotated Alice that Coxeter had sent him." So there's this wonderful triangle of Gardner, Coxeter, and Escher. And so the first column was really about Coxeter's book. And so Escher was mentioned, and Escher's tessellation was published in the book and in Gardner's column. But in '66, Gardner wrote a column completely dedicated to Escher's work. And there were 9 reproductions in that article of Escher's work. And that's the article that really got Escher's work known to the American public. There had been a couple of earlier articles in Time and one other magazine, I've forgotten, perhaps Life, but that hadn't, had much influence. It was Gardner's column with these 9 reproductions that, in fact, Escher said, and I think I quoted it last night, that I have no peace, especially from the American audience.
He benefited financially because I assume that means that earlier he wasn't doing so well financially.
That's right.
So how was his fortunes changed by this?
His fortune, well, once he became known to the American public, there was a great demand for his work. The grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Cornelius von Schack Roosevelt, became kind of a middleman. He was already a collector of Escher's work and a good friend to Escher. And Escher, up until the early '60s, was really just selling graphic works out of his house. He didn't have an agent, and he certainly didn't have an agent in America. And so Roosevelt became his informal agent, and then that ultimately turned it over to a gallery in Washington. And so Escher could say, get in touch with this gallery if you want some of my work.
You clearly have a melding of 2 worlds in your work. And your mathematics has greatly influenced your understanding of the artistic world. But professionally, as a mathematician, can you say if the artistic world has had an impact on you?
As a mathematician, I'm not sure. As a person, I still love art. I have my favorite artists. I love to go to museums. I don't personally know a whole lot of artists, but I know many who cross the worlds in terms of math and art because of what I've written, because of what I've taught. And I still get great joy from what I think is good art.
Well, everyone who's attended this understands that you're a great lecturer and ambassador for this intersection of the two. And we thank you for coming.
Thank you.